Welcome back, everybody, to MTG Insider, episode number 14, a special edition. This time, we have a fantastic guest, Dominic Harvey, fresh off a top four from Pro Tour Barcelona, the modern Pro Tour that just happened last weekend. He's a regular writer for Star City Games. He does a fantastic column over there, which you should definitely go check out if you're into competitive Magic, covering a bunch of different formats. As well as a podcast, Dominaria's Judgment, which is a fantastic podcast, again, with Ari Lax, another great, well-known pro. And is there anything else you do, Dom? Introduce us to yourself and any work you have coming up.
Yeah, that's about it. I do coaching, so accepting clients. Do reach out if that's something that you're interested in, and plan to dabble in streaming at some point. I have said I plan to dabble in streaming in the past and never really followed through. So hopefully, saying it in public in as many places as possible will actually hold me to that commitment. But yeah, you nailed it.
Oh man, I would love to see you stream. I love to see just the great minds of the game stream. Like I want to see more, Wafo Tapas and Nassifs and all the top names and stuff. Kai, another one of your Pro Tour competitors, that would be great to see. So hey, the more people doing it, someone like yourself who's an expert, modern specialist, and yeah, I love to see it. So thank you so much for being here. Now, let's start with last weekend. So you qualified for the Pro Tour. You went out there. Now, a lot of people, I guess, who play competitive Magic, they can watch the Pro Tour and they see all the pros play, and sometimes, they see things that pros do that, suboptimal plays or this or that. What they don't realize is the travel time. Half of you guys are jet lagged and staying in all sorts of different accommodations, maybe having issues with food or other stuff. The weather, it was, super hot in Europe while you guys were there. I mean, how does the travel affect you? Before we even get to the tournament itself, what is it like, traveling halfway across the world to go to these tournaments?
It really varies depending on who you are. For me, it's pretty grueling. I don't really suffer from jet lag, but everything else about it, just the food and the travel and the sleep disruption does get to me. So I knew I would have to deal with that over the course of the week. And then my team is pretty cosmopolitan. We have a lot of players from China, Taiwan, New Zealand, Australia, and all of them basically have much more demanding travel schedules than I do. It takes them a day and a half to get home with 3 different layovers, and it's a nightmare. So they really are playing on hard mode, and that's the people for whom that kind of travel is even possible. We had one of our team members, Nick Price, who lives in the Philippines, and getting a visa for any kind of complicated travel from there is a massive ordeal. And he had such a roller coaster of, he thought it would be approved and then it wasn't, and then maybe there was some last minute switch, but oh no, just kidding. So he wasn't even able to join us in the end. So compared to the rest of my team, I actually had it pretty good. But yeah, it's tough. And look, I love Barcelona. I love traveling to Europe, right? But there is part of you, once you come back from that kind of wishes every event was just in your backyard in, PT Toronto every single time. Like that would be more suitable in some regards. So definitely some trade-offs there.
Yeah, I totally understand. I mean, and it gets worse the older you get. Now I'm just like, I don't even want to leave the house to hang out with people that live, 30 minutes away and never on a Magic tournament that we used to travel to all the time. But yeah, I was listening to the story with Nick Price on the MTG Grindcast with CCR. They were interviewing him, and I couldn't believe it. I thought, wow, that's really unfortunate. You qualify for the Pro Tour, you make this big effort to get in this tournament, and you do it, and then to not be able to go because of something like a visa is, that's got to be frustrating. But I'm glad to hear you didn't have any issues and you got there fine. So how are the first few days? So you arrive in Barcelona. Did you go right into the testing house and get to work, or what was the other team kind of trickle in one by one, or were there people already there when you got there?
Yeah, so but because of how I had booked, I was only able to come out on Monday night, and so I get there Tuesday afternoon. And by that point, it's getting pretty close to the tournament already. Most of them have been there for a few days, and I arrived just at the point where everyone is having this 48 hours out crisis of confidence over their deck choice, and people are switching back and forth, and then finding reasons to go back to the deck that is their favorite and that they kind of wanted to play the whole time. And so it was a kind of state of pandemonium when I arrived. And then once that had all settled down a little bit, we get back just into draft preparation and so on. And that was a little more serene, although even that causes you to question your assumptions, and that's kind of the point of doing it, right? So it was pretty frenetic, but the way we had it set up, there was chance for, it was, you play hard, you work hard, or other way around. You know what I'm
Something
saying
like
here?
that. Yeah.
You know, we get to draft, then we get to go in the pool and hang out, and then back to drafting again. So I got
Oh,
to mix business with pleasure.
nice. So it was a nice experience, at least while you were there. You got to do some stuff, sightseeing a little bit and whatnot, and enjoy the weather.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I've been to Barcelona a few times before. It is maybe the favorite place I visited as a
Mm,
tourist, and so I've seen a lot of the big stuff. So went back to some old haunts, you know, the places I always like to come back to. But for the most part,
nice.
was happy to spend most of the time focused on Magic, and then uh,
Yeah.
luckily my sightseeing time was cut into by doing well enough in the tournament that I had to be at the venue. So
Yeah.
um,
First
you know,
world problems. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, good problem to have. So ticked off the stuff I wanted to see, and still managed to, you know, get the business trip part of it nailed in as well.
That's great. Okay, let's get into the testing. So you arrive at the testing house. How big is the team? Like, how many people are you testing with for this pro tour? I imagine it's different for each large event that you go to, but how did it work?
Yeah, I think for this one we had something in the order of 20, and then there were a few people
Wow.
who were there not qualified, but just to hang out and help with the process and enjoy the
Wow.
Magic Con that's surrounding the Pro Tour as well.
Right.
And so with a group that size, you understand that not everyone is always going to be on the same page, and
Right.
herding a small group of Magic players is like herding cats, let alone a big one. So there's going to be
Yeah.
some slack in the process, and one challenger is making sure that people are on the same page and that there's some continuity to the process. At the same time, one of the advantages there is that you're always going to have 8 people to draft, right? Sometimes 2 pods of 8 at the same time. So anything that requires a lot of actual manpower, you just have that in spades.
Right.
So I think, you know, I want to continue exploring like different team sizes, configurations, and so on. And I know there are some people who really prefer working in these small groups where you're all dedicated on the same goal, and you can just compare notes and like rapidly iterate
Right.
on that. But there are some nice things about having this bigger group as well.
Yeah, you can brute force things more easily and really get to the bottom of, yeah, what's going on in this matchup? What is the cyber? Somebody get on this, figure that out. Especially for limited. I imagine it's easier to brute force a limited format when you have just more minds on it, more people, going at it. Whereas constructed, everybody kind of has their niche. Some people are very attached to, like you said, some specific deck. And it's interesting, getting to that topic. I mean, obviously, now in hindsight, you chose to play Amulet Titan, and it ended up being an excellent choice for you. Now, people hear your name and they know, of course, your background with this deck. For those of you who don't know, Dom wrote this incredible, 80-page long, and I know, everybody talks about it, but it really is fantastic. And God, I would love to have one of these primers for every deck in the format. It would be incredible. But you went above and beyond, wrote this incredible, thoroughly in-depth primer for the Amulet Titan deck. And then Lord of the Rings drops, and the One Ring comes out, and suddenly Amulet Titan and a lot of other decks that were, very powerful decks are kind of slipping away from the challenges. You're not seeing them show up in, a lot of the results on Magic Online and elsewhere. What goes through your head when you're in that testing house? And was anybody else on Amulet Titan besides you?
Well, so one other guy, so Jack Potter, aka House of Mana, another local Amulet player that just lives a few hours away from me. I pushed hard to get him on the team because we're kind of on the same page with this deck, and we were, all of these different deck groups had their little meetings before the submission deadline. So there's this Tron group over here and the Runners group over here, and then the Amulet group was just me and Jack just sitting down hashing stuff out because, understandably, no one else wanted to take the plunge along with us. Funnily enough, there were a few people who were drawn to the deck initially, and they said that they looked at my guide and were so like scared off by the level of detail. There's like, I don't have time to actually internalize this, but it's exactly the opposite of what I'm going for, right? Like I want this to be a good entry point for people who are currently intimidated but do want to learn more. And instead, I took people who did want to learn more and intimidated them away from it. So yeah, maybe need to publish like a more entry level guide at some point, but.
The Cole's notes, like
yeah.
Amulet for Dummies, maybe.
Yeah. So I mean, the nice thing about Modern is you can have your default. You can have the deck which, assuming nothing too big changes, you can go back to. And where you want Modern to be is a format where, if you had no preference, these are the top few decks. But if you're playing your deck, your tier 2 deck at close to optimal capacity, using that experience that you have, then that's going to be a equal or better choice than just defaulting to the newest bandwagon. And there have been times in the past where that hasn't been true. So the last modern PT in Barcelona with Hogak, right? Like you had to beat Hogak or you had to join Hogak, and there was really no in between.
Yeah.
This time around, it was a little bit like that, but there was more variety. So
Right.
for the people who, if conveniently, if you love playing Rhinos, well, Rhinos was also a good choice. You could do that. But
Yeah.
even if your deck wasn't mainstream in that way, you could kind of talk yourself into sticking with it if you were so inclined.
Right. And I mean, there's so many powerful decks in the metagame that so many of them can juke and they can kind of adapt very easily. Like you saw the Hammer Time decks kind of adapting to the one ring, and Bowmasters specifically, seeing an uptick in popularity. Like Amulet Titan, for example. There were people playing with the ring in it. There were people trying all sorts of different sideboard plans and other stuff with these various decks. Creativity, Titan, Rhinos. What do you think about the, so you were like, I know this deck inside out. I know this deck better than anybody, and that alone already gives me the foundation to maybe succeed with this deck, whereas if I switch to a different deck, I might not get there. But how do you change the deck to be better in the face of like Rakdos, the most anticipated deck? Everybody knows it's going to see a ton of play. It's not a great matchup for Amulet. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but I didn't think it was anyway. But to see you play it, it didn't seem that bad. So what were the big innovations you arrived at with the Amulet Titan to kind of get it in a place where you were confident submitting it and against the field of Rakdos and all this stuff?
Yeah, there was nothing too revolutionary there, I would say. The One Ring was a really big pickup for the deck and obviously had a massive effect on the format as a whole. And so unclear if those kind of ripple effects were good for the deck on the whole. But just in terms of putting the One Ring in the deck, it was a great addition, fixed a lot of the problems you had before, and also was very good against Rakdos in particular. So
Mhm.
I think that is a bad matchup. You're not wrong there. I don't need to correct you, but I have a lot of experience with this deck winning matchups that I'm told are bad, and which I would say honestly are bad, but you find a way, and I think the deck is actually pretty
Yeah.
customizable, even though it looks very wonky and has a lot of specific demands. So if you want
Right.
to target a specific matchup, you usually can do that. And we had not a plan we were super confident in, but at least a plan we thought was decent against Black Red, and turns out
Right.
I beat it 4 times in the Swiss. Eventually
Yeah.
lost in the top 8, and that loss felt a little overdue at that point. But
Hmm.
even then, made him work for it.
Yeah, no, I loved it. I all the matches, the whole tournament. I mean, like from a top-down perspective, we can talk about it in a second. It all was just fabulous. Your story is incredible. We'll get to that in a second. But so yeah, the deck itself, maybe also benefiting from the fact that Rakdos kind of wasn't worried about Amulet Titan and some of these other decks. They were already angling toward beating other specific matchups, like you saw the number of Blood Moons go down in the deck and things like that, which only really help you, like helps the even though it's not specifically for anything to do with Amulet Titan. You're kind of benefiting from maybe the Rakdos deck focusing on other matchups and by extension making the matchup against Amulet better for the Amulet player. Did you notice that a lack of Blood Moons? I know Blood Moon was all over the place, but I think most of the Rakdos lists I saw, at least toward the top tables, weren't playing as many as I had seen previously in a lot of the lists on MTGO and stuff. But
Yeah, so when Rakdos took over, that was a really troubling development, and it felt like
mm,
every new thing that happened that changed the format in the weeks leading up to the tournament was bad news for me. So the question was like, where is the tipping point where I just have to give in and jump off this deck? But I think things kind of looped around a bit to where if you think Rakdos is going to be the most popular deck and the mirror is going to be the most important thing, where you start looking at what cards are good or bad in the mirror and what decks are people going to play to try and beat Rakdos, and how good are cards like Blood Moon against them? And you
right,
come to the conclusion that a lot of the Rakdos players that I face came to, which is that I'd rather have my Blood Moons in the sideboard, try and slant my deck a bit more towards the mirror or those tough matchups in game one, which
right,
I think made a lot of sense for them to do, but made my matchup in game one against them quite a bit better. And you see this across the board too. So in the Rhino decks, for example, if you
hmm,
go back a few months, you look online, all of those lists are going to have a bunch of Force figures in the sideboard. These days,
right,
though, what are you hoping to Force figure, given that Hammer's disappeared and there's just
yeah,
no clear target for that? So, and especially in an open deckless tournament where if they came to that conclusion, how many forces you're going to go up against. and that goes across the board. Because like Dress Down, for example, all-time low, maybe
Yeah.
since their release in this tournament. A
Yeah.
lot of subtleties, which is that's one of the scary cards to play against. But if you try and balance out all of those effects, I think things were generally moving in a direction that was good for Titan, even if some of the
Yeah.
specific stuff was quite scary.
Yeah, right. I think you're absolutely right. It's interesting how those ripple effects kind of spread and can affect the metagame, even though decks that may normally not be a good matchup suddenly are reconfiguring themselves to be better in the wider meta, and that makes your match better. So Amulet, yeah, you felt was a good choice. Were there any final thoughts in terms of constructed before locking in that deck? Did you have any last minute kind of like, oh god, is that the rest of the team? Because again, most of the team is not on the deck you're on. It's got to feel a little bit like you're in the little voice in the back of your head going, maybe I should be on the team deck, maybe I should be on this other. Was there any last minute kind of indecision there before you locked it in?
Oh yeah, I was waffling between different things. I was going to play Tron myself for quite a while, and I had accepted my fate, but wasn't confident in my choice necessarily. But seeing everyone else also go through the same indecision of, do I jump towards a deck that seems to have some momentum? Do I just go with a deck which I would have registered 2 weeks ago? I think it was a very relatable process for a lot of people, right? And so
Right.
a lot of our team, they ended up registering, some of them played Creativity, for example, which
Oh yeah.
was not which used to be like this tier 1 deck, litmus test for everything in the
Mhm.
format. By the
Mhm.
time this tournament came around, it wasn't that anymore. It's the
Right.
deck that you only played if that was a deck that you really wanted to play a few weeks ago and had not found anything to move you off that yet. And
Right.
so we had equivalents of that for various people on our team. And so
Mhm.
my default deck was a little less mainstream than that, for example, but
Mhm.
same principle still applies, I think.
Oh yeah, and again, the factor, like the knowledge aspect of it, the fact that you are so well versed with the deck is giving you those points. Legacy is very familiar with these, formats that have these very high powered decks. Like knowing your deck is almost more important than switching at the last minute to a deck maybe you're not as comfortable with, but objectively maybe more powerful. So that's awesome to see. You locked in the amulet. What about the limited testing? So I loved the limited format. I don't know how much you love Lord of the
Mm.
Rings. I really enjoyed it. And it was kind of interesting. I was wondering, like, this is a long time to have a limited format available to test with before the Pro Tour. Normally, we get it like a couple weeks before a week before the Pro Tour, and this was like a month or more. And I thought, wow, this should be interesting. Maybe we see some real interesting, limited archetypes that haven't been too explored in the wider community on the arena for sure, but even on MTGO where the competition's a little bit stiffer. How was the limited testing? Was it what you expected? Did you anything new in the testing house that came out, or?
I did like the draft format a lot too, and as you say, there was a lot of lead time for preparation, and that went for modern as well, right? So
Right.
if you're someone who you've been playing the same modern deck for years, you could just run it back at this PT, focus on limited, and then you had a lot of time to focus on limited if you
Hmm.
want to. So I think that actually even the playing field a decent amount for the people who work a 9 to 5, have a lot of other commitments. I don't have a ton of time to actually put into testing for the tournament, and so it felt like by the time the PT came around, everyone knew what the consensus was with the limited format, and even the more the stuff that maybe was less obvious at first has had more time to be explored and is more known. So, for example, if you'd held the PT within a week or two of the set's release, you might still be stuck in this mindset of green is unplayable, just avoid green at all costs. And then once people figured
Right.
out what you need to do for the green decks to work a few weeks in, it's possible that a team that has more time to focus on that, has limited experience, they could have taken the Pro Tour by storm just by knowing how to
Hmm.
draft green. This time, though, like if
Right.
you were open to the idea of drafting green, then the stuff was out there for you to know how to do that. So there was kind of no excuse, I guess, for not being aware. But yeah, I don't think this was given just what the format is like and also how much time there was. I don't think you were going to see some limited archetype coming completely out of the blue
Right.
and breaking it in that way.
Yeah, it's just funny. It reminded when I saw Calcano again, getting top 8 and
Mm,
stuff. I thought to myself, man, I remember that. Was it Pro Tour Amonkhet where that Slither
yeah.
Blade deck came out of nowhere, and I thought, wow. And I had drafted a ton of that set, and nobody I knew was, So anyway, nothing like that happening here, especially with the lead time. I imagine most of the archetypes and most of the stuff would be fully explored, and Yeah, I think even by that time, as you said, yeah, teams are on to the fact that, you know what, everybody knows black red's the best. Like, let's just, try and figure out how do you maximize these cards that are wheeling all the time, the green, the white cards, So really interesting. Any final thoughts on, things like the open deck lists have been interesting. Like this is another Pro Tour where it's open deck lists. We didn't have open deck list Pro Tours back in the day. It was, and now we do. There's mixed feelings on this. I think it's a good thing. I love it when all the players have kind of the information, but I know other players disagree. What do you think about having open deck lists for these tournaments?
Yeah, I think it has some downsides, but overall, it's just such a much more pleasant experience. I think
Hmm.
where you can you can post your list on Twitter without kind of leaking crucial information, and people can see your list. And if it's something a bit off the wall, they can get excited about it, and you can generate some buzz. And people always love sharing what they registered or what they wanted to register but didn't before
Oh
the
yeah,
tournament. You feel like you have more freedom to do that now. If logistically, if you need to source cards at the last minute, then you can do that without kind of giving the game away in that sense.
yeah.
And one of the arguments against it is that it stymies innovation, because if people can tell what we're doing, there's less chance to blindside them completely. And I think
Hmm.
what we've seen is that just isn't really the case as much.
Yeah.
Either these individual card choices or just deck choices entirely, like you still see people trying to shoot for the moon, even
Hmm.
when people could just look at the list beforehand and see how they're trying to do that.
Yeah.
So I think that criticism is a bit overstated. And then when you take into account just all of the ways that it makes the experience more seamless, more enjoyable, I become a big convert to open deck lists, even though, for the holdouts who prefer things the old way, like I see where they're coming from, but I think it just moves things along so well that I'm a fan.
I agree. Yeah, yeah. The scouting and all the nonsense that used to happen back in the day.
Yeah, yeah.
Done with that. Don't need that. Okay, great. So let's jump to the actual Pro Tour. So the Pro Tour starts now. I know I was watching most of it. I couldn't catch the entire thing, but I saw almost all of it. I went back and watched as much of your coverage as I could. I wish you were in the feature match area more often. They had so many like Tron decks and Rhinos and Rakdos, and it's like, and then they would show you doing and I'm like, wow, finally, yes, another deck, or but that was it. Like they needed to diversify. Anyway, I did go back and watch. I know you had a rough start. You started that first draft with, I guess it was an 0-2 record, I think, right? And that's one of
Yeah.
those moments where you're just like, I mean, I don't know. How do you rally from that? Like, what is your process? Do you just, okay, I need to step away. I need to, refocus, or what is it that you do to get back on track after something like that?
Yeah, I don't really have a specific method. The way it happened was that my round three, I thought I was going to 0-3, not just 0-2. And at that point, that really would have put me out of it mentally and just
Yeah,
mathematically too. It's very difficult to actually convert that into a decent finish at that stage.
right.
But after this incredible, miraculous comeback in that round three, where I had to see how I could possibly win the game and guide things in that direction, and my opponent had to act in such a way that left the door open for that, and I needed the exact right combination of cards to punish him and convert on that. That
Yeah.
that that gave me this kind of buzz during that break before Modern, where I think if I'd been 2-1 with like a unremarkable but good limited deck, I'd have felt fine. But after this 1-2, I was like, let's go. I have the second wind,
Yeah.
and
The
I kind of
adrenaline and yeah.
yeah, and after that, after I kind of cheated death like that, I viewed the rest of the tournament as a free roll of sorts. Like if
Hmm.
hey, I should have been for the count already. If I can run this up into something, then great. But if not, I'll see what I can do. Um, and
Hmm.
so that almost when there were even stranger twists and turns later on in the tournament, that gave me the mental capacity to just be like, yeah, this is just one part of this story where I am a scripted character, and
Yeah.
we'll see what happens. Versus, um, I am someone who, if I throw a match because I make some silly mistake and that is costly for how my tournament plays out, like I'm going to fixate on that in the moment and then also remember it in a dream like 5 years later or something. So
Yes, never
it's
forget. Yeah.
yeah. It's not easy to get that stuff out of your mind, but I
Right.
think what this weekend really drove home with not just my personal journey to the top eight, but also just the conditions we were under with the heat and everything, and just in general was these tournaments are marathons, and part of having success at them is it's not just playing the games in the moment and making the right deck choice and stuff. It's knowing that like you will make mistakes and you will go through difficult things or get bounced out of games through variance and so on, and knowing how to rebound from that promptly and properly is a big key to success, and it is
Yeah.
part of how good you are as a player, right? Like, it's not just what happens on the table, it's what happens off it as well.
Oh,
And
absolutely.
so I don't know, I wouldn't say that I have some great mental game or whatever generally, but
Mhm.
the weird circumstances of this tournament allowed me to almost put myself in the mindset where I could shrug off a lot of the weird stuff that came
Yeah.
later on. So, but you think about someone like Reduke, for example, right? Like,
Mhm.
such an impressive, formidable player in so many ways. Like, obviously great at technical play and all these other facets of the game, but also maybe the best in the world at just shrugging off a bad start and rallying and running it up. And there have
Oh
been a
yeah.
few PTs where he's 1-2 after the first draft pot or something, and he kind of fades from your view, and then you check back at the end of day 2 and he's 11-4, 12-4
Yeah.
or something, and
Yeah.
maybe the best at rallying after that kind of start. And so if you're evaluating players, like, that is a big component of success at this level.
Right.
And I don't have his ability to just, he will famously play out every tournament until the bitter end. Basically, I'm someone who, if I'm 0-2 and something online and with a deck that I don't particularly care for, like, I'll just drop and do something else with my day, and
Right.
avoid, maybe there's some lesson to be learned in 7 rounds. I'm not going to stick around to find out.
Right.
But I don't think anyone necessarily can or should try to do what he does, but he does it, and he does it very well.
Yeah. Oh, I remember at that last Pro Tour with I can't. It was the Planeswalker, the red-green Planeswalker's name escapes me, and he misread it because it was the Phyrexian, and I thought, oh my god, in a future match, it's a Hall of Fame pro, and he does this, and I have to imagine, if it's a less prestigious player, they might just chalk it up to, yeah, I'm not one of these other guys and girls who is currently the best in the world, but to see a best in the world kind of caliber player do that, it's everybody kind of goes like, wow, did I just see him just straight up RTFC not realize what that card did? Now, granted, it was in Phyrexian, which is a whole separate thing. I think those shouldn't even be allowed in the Pro Tour, but that's a whole set anyway. So yeah, to bounce back the mental game, and even like you said, these things are marathons. You said, I was reading about this. The tournament venue was apparently a sauna, and it was sweltering in there. I mean, you've got to stay hydrated. You've got to make sure you eat. I mean, there's many articles, many pro content creators have talked about this kind of thing. I've played in GPs and stuff before. Yeah, if you make it to day 2 and you're, first day 1's like 9-10 rounds or whatever, it's like, oh my god, you've got to keep eating, you've got to keep drinking, and a lot of people like ignore that, especially when the adrenaline is going and you don't even notice. I haven't eaten in 5 hours or 6 or 7 hours, whatever it is, right? So I imagine, yeah, you're on top of that, keeping track of, making sure you're staying hydrated.
Well, I tried. I mean, it's easier said than done sometimes, but it's
Right.
people like to joke that the easiest content to produce in Magic is just some article saying get a good night's sleep and stay hydrated and so on. And it, people make those jokes for a reason, but also people say that shit for a reason. You do actually have to do it. You gotta follow through, not be playing the tournament on hard mode for no good reason. And
Yeah.
I mean, stuff like the heat is just unavoidable. There's nothing we could do about that. And turns out legally, there was not actually much they could do about it either, other than not booking a venue like that in the middle of summer in Barcelona. But given where we were at the time, it's
Yeah.
there's some stuff you can control and some stuff you can't. You gotta just nail down the stuff you can, because otherwise everything's going to be that much harder.
Right. Yeah, it's unfortunate. I heard they had this issue with the venue last time as well. Like, there were players who had been there before saying the same thing. But anyway, let's move on. So going back to the Constructed, so you had a little bit of a rough start, but then that third game revitalizes you. You go through the next, or the first 4 rounds of Constructed, and then you get to the second draft. I didn't get to see any of that draft, but it went fairly well. I imagine. I'm not sure exactly how you finished up there.
Easy 3-0. First actual
Nice.
3-0 at this level of competition. But
Awesome.
yeah, I mean, I found the open lane. People just force fed me green, which I was happy to have, and then I also opened 2 of the best rares in the set. So that was the cherry on top there, and just glided to a pretty easy 3-0, and really was on top of the world after that, because it's coming out of day 1, 5-3. If I 5-3 again, I re-qualify for Chicago, and that was the goal at that point. Anything higher was a stretch goal. So starting off with the 3-0 in the draft, which usually I rate my constructed skills a lot higher than my limited skills, get to 8-3, and now 2-3 gets me to Chicago. So I was feeling really good about that, and I can't expect to have that easy of a time in draft every single time, but that one experience, it was a nice bucket list item, but also gave me that sense of confidence moving into the final stretch.
Right, right. Speaking of bucket list items, I mean, yeah, so you come off this draft, you're 3-0, you're flying high, and then jump ahead a few rounds. We get to, what was it, round 13, on camera. And this was incredible. This was, people were linking this in my Discord and elsewhere. Holy crap, Dom just won a game with 2 amulets in play. And I'm like, I have to say, I go back, I'm watching the VOD, and I'm just like, wow. So, I don't know if you want to go over just what happened. That was an incredible game. And I know this kind of thing has probably happened to you before. I know Amulet Titan can win with no lands in play, and 2 amulets is enough, You just need top. And Cedric, being an awesome commentator that he is, called this just before you ripped that land. He was like, I think if Dom rips a land here, he can just win the game on the spot. And sure enough, and then I remember, we couldn't see you, but your hands, you were, when you pulled that top card, you were just like, you lean back, and you could just read the excitement in your reaction there. Can you just go over that round real quick and tell us, because that was incredible to see.
Yeah, Cedric's been calling my matches with Amulet on the SCG tour, since 5 years ago at this point. So he knows what the deal is, and I think once you've played a deck for so long and you kind of know what events lead to the next event, you become kind of jaded, right? Where like I knew sitting there, all right, well, I need to draw the bounce land. I have a X out of however many chance of doing that, and turns out I hit, and so I'm going to win the game. But for people who don't know that off the top of their head, it's a really exciting moment to see going from like just 2 amulets in play to 2 Titans attacking for 32 and everything in between. And I wanted them to get to enjoy that, and also there's a level of showmanship that you want to have when you're on the feature match, right? So instead of just drawing my card and kind of sliding it and then slow running it a little bit to them and to myself, and then once I see it, I just snap forward in my chair because I know we're off to the races now. And there was some genuine like, oh wow, this is going to be great as well. So that was a lot of fun. So even though I knew, like, I'm going to win the game, even if he had held up the Terminate or whatever, I would just plow through that. So in a way, for me, that game 3, where it was a lot more grindy, a lot less flashy, but just still a lot of twists and turns along the way, and struggling to stabilize so that then I have another chance to top deck, and I did top deck, so now I get another chance to do the same thing. That game to me was much more of a kind of wild, memorable experience than the game 1, which is, I mean, it's great TV, right? It's good content, but it's also, I've been there a few times before.
Yeah, right. Yeah, Modern's not a form. I mean, the last Modern Pro Tour was what, 5 years ago? So a lot of people, now since the pandemic, so many players just coming up on Arena and being more digital players. A lot of them aren't really familiar with all the things that can happen in Modern, things that can go on. So seeing that for a lot of players who aren't really, into Modern, was pretty amazing. I thought it was it was great to catch it on camera, because it's one of those highlights that, and to do it on the biggest stage and everything else was fantastic. So you're doing great, and then we get to the final few rounds. It's round 15, and you are pretty much like a lock for 9th, right? I mean, at that point there was no way you were getting top 8, like almost 0%. And I was watching the last round, and it was Hain against Kosaka, I think his name was, and when they got to turns, I thought, wow, what is going on here? And then they gave them 7 turns? And I was like, whoa, instead of 5 extra turns, 7. I don't think I've ever seen that. And I thought, this is crazy.
Well,
yeah?
Yeah, so that happens when a slow play warning has been issued in the match previously. So to stop that also affecting the conclusion of the game in extra turns, they add on those extra turns on the end to kind of mitigate the effects of that. But yeah, so that last round, I was playing for 9th or so, I thought, and 9th versus if I lose, I get, let's say, 18th, 19th, that's still a massive difference in terms of both the
prize
payout
money,
and it turns out if I lost, I would have missed Worlds by exactly 1 match win for the 2nd year in a row, just out of nowhere. So it turns out the stakes are even higher than I realized at the time. But yeah, I mean, I win my round 16 very quickly, and then I'm left to just kind of decompress and try and recover from just the long and stressful day, while also not realizing that day isn't over yet, and in fact the outcome of it is being determined over there a few feet away from me, just
So
outside of my knowledge.
you had no idea. So when you finished your last round, you're like, all right, that was great. You know, I feel really great. I mean, ninth, that's incredible. And so, but you were
Yep.
just like, that's it. My day is done. I'm not expecting. And then it turns out, yeah, Hain and Kosaka draw after the 7 extra turns. They draw. So suddenly you squeak in. I mean, how did you find out? Like, I guess you didn't leave the building or anything. You were still hanging around. You still have a lot of friends there and everything else. Who told you? Who made you realize? Holy crap, Dom! You made top 8. Like, what's how did it go
Well,
down?
I thought I was ninth, and I was happy with ninth. After that terrible start, and I'd made peace with it. A lot of great pro careers, when you look back, have started with a ninth place, which then gives them
Yeah.
the kick they need to go succeed later on. So ninth, is fine. Some good stories to tell, and a nice payout, and a few more chances
Oh yeah.
to play again. So, but I'm just sitting there in the play area waiting for that match to finish because some of my friends are watching. I want to go to dinner afterwards, and I'm kind of wanting the day to wrap up so that that can happen.
Right.
Luckily, it didn't wrap up as soon as I wanted because it was not on my radar that that match could end in a draw, really.
Yeah.
Just knowing, first of all, what the matchup is, it can be pretty fast one way or the other.
Right.
And also, depending on who the players are in that kind of spot, a lot of the times, one player, if it goes to time, will say, okay, that one player is quite far ahead, so one of us should concede, and maybe there's
Yeah.
some like understanding after the fact. But in this
Right.
case, none of that happened, and so I'm just sitting there, and I can't see what's going on through the crowd, but there's this kind of murmur that happens, and then people start coming up to me and saying, "Oh, they're going to draw," and I hadn't processed yet that if they draw, I'm in,
Yeah.
but they have to walk me through that like very patiently, and so it seems like they're about to draw, but again, it's rare that it ends that way, even if it maybe should
Right.
organically, and so I'm just not trying to read anything into it or get my hopes up, and
Right.
then eventually Will Hall, who was on his first coverage shift that weekend, kind of beckons me towards the arena because they need me there for when the announcement's being made. Um,
Oh wow.
and
That's when it
so
sunk in. That's when you
yeah,
realized.
that's when it seemed official because it's like, well, they wouldn't do this unless they were sure.
Yeah.
And then once I'm behind the rope again, Simon Nielsen, who was also in the top 8,
Right.
shows me the standings on Melee, where it's updated and the top 8 is logged in, and I'm there in 8th. And so
Nice.
coverage actually captured that moment pretty well, where you see him showing me with this excited look, and then me just like
Yeah.
aghast, and then
Yeah.
hugging
Yeah.
him, and 3 separate photos of that. So yeah, I mean
Oh, that's great.
that was just the after what had already seemed like a very strange and bizarre weekend. That was the final just epic
What a
twist that
roller
what
coaster. Yeah.
very much went in my favor.
Yeah, it was so awesome to see. And again, yeah, just a roller coaster of the start that you had and then the different rounds and how it all went, the draft, second draft, and then, okay, maybe finishing ninth. And then right at the last second, the most unlikely of circumstances occurs and you get in. It was just awesome to see. And yeah, super cool. So now you're in the top 8. So suddenly, oh my God, this is incredible. Like this is one of the, the great finishes of your career, and all this stuff. It's an incredible goal. Everybody's trying to, get the top 8 at a pro tour, everybody who plays competitive Magic. So you feel great. You're on top of the world, but now it's the pro tour. You look at the other people the top 8. You look at the other people in the top 8. You look at what they're playing. It's a weird mix, right? I mean, we've got 3 Tron decks, 3 Rhino decks, Rakdos, yourself. And so how do you feel about this? What do you think your chances are going into this top 8?
Yeah, it's a land of contrast, right? Like the Tron, historically, very good matchup for Amulet.
Right,
Scam, Rakdos, historically, very much not. And then Rhinos, somewhere in between, I think, is a little tougher now than it used to be because of all the subtleties and so on. And
right.
depending on how much hate they had for Tron, but also the other big mana decks like that. So it seemed like on my side of the bracket, I knew I was going against Javier on Tron, and then either Rhinos or Scam in the semifinals, and then
Right.
probably Tron again in the finals. So it felt like
Yeah.
the semifinals was where the tournament was going to be decided in a way. And if I could get past that, I liked my odds. But yeah, well, that's where I finally fell at that hurdle. But
Yeah.
it seemed like I wasn't going to take anything for granted. Like, on the draw, Tron can still be a scary matchup, and I'm
Oh
against
yeah.
one of the best active players in the world right now. So not counting my chickens, but
Right.
if I was going to have to play against him in any matchup, like this would be it basically. So
Right, and it was, yeah. I think it's yeah. I think you had a great top eight there, because again, the way the Tron decks, they all lined up against the Rhino decks, and the Tron decks had a great matchup against Rhinos, and they ended up just kicking all the Rhinos players out in the quarterfinals. Which, yeah, that was one of your worst matchups gone. But then, yeah, you get paired up against Rakdos, and the rest is history. But that is fantastic. The top eight, was a great experience, I'm sure, and just it was such a Cinderella story in so many ways. I mean, your story was incredible. Jake Beardsley, of course, winning the whole thing, his first Pro Tour. Simon Nielsen and Javier Dominguez, back to back Pro Tour top eights. Like the whole Pro Tour, even the feedback, I was, in the chat and seeing what people were saying, but also after the fact on Twitter and elsewhere. People loved this Pro Tour. They thought the commentary was on point. They thought, everything was great. The time, the cadence of, all the matches and everything. There was no kind of dead air and wasted time and everything else. But we're all over here on the other side of the screen. For somebody who's down there on the floor, you just mentioned Will Hall coming up to you and saying, "Hey, we're going to be doing the announcement. Get over here." In terms of those organizational things, how was the tournament itself in terms of WotC's direction and the production? Was it all smooth sailing? Was there any confusion of where to go and who to talk to and blah blah blah, or was the whole thing kind of a smooth affair on that side of things?
that all felt pretty smooth for the most part, and there also is
Nice.
this underbelly of it that you really don't get to see unless you're lucky enough
Right.
to get to that stage. So when we went behind the literal curtain, and then you see this jungle of monitors and cables and everything, and people running around,
Right.
and there's a lot of moving parts that go into
Oh
making it what
yeah.
it is. And yeah, once I was able to go back and watch some of the coverage, it did seem like a lot of stuff on that side had really leveled up compared to even just the last Pro Tour.
Hmm.
And so I know there were complaints about the state of the format and so on, and we can debate that back and forth. But in terms
Right.
of everything else about the Pro Tour experience and the broadcast, then all of that had really been taken to a new high.
Nice. So you recommend a good experience. You recommend everybody try the Pro Tour someday if they can.
Yeah, I mean, well, so your first PT always has this kind of mythological aspect to it, right? Where
Right.
you, it's this that itself is a bucket list item for a lot of players starting out. It certainly was for me. And then once you get there, there's this duality to it where the scales fall from your eyes, and you see that it is just another Magic tournament, but at the same time, it's a really cool Magic tournament, and you,
Mm.
especially if your first time doesn't go well, then you want to go back there and you want that shot of redemption. If you win your
Right.
first Pro Show, on the other hand, as we saw this weekend for the first time in I think almost 18
Oh,
years,
yeah.
then I don't know what the reaction is. It's a good
Yeah.
problem to have too, but um,
Right.
either way, that first PT has a significance that the other ones just by definition are not going to. And for the people who, I know there are many who like they qualified for their first PT either just before COVID hit or under COVID, and so they got to play in some of these online tournaments and so on, and maybe that was a fun experience in its own right. But it's not the same. It's not
No.
your first PT,
Right.
and yeah, I hope the people who felt they were robbed of that still get to play that first PT
Yeah.
themselves someday.
Cool. Oh, that's great to hear. Yeah, I love it. So it sounds like it was a great tournament. Obviously, it was great for you. Let's zoom out now and just get to kind of the overview of Modern here. You're a Modern specialist. You've been playing Modern for years. It's kind of, would you say it's like your main format that you
I
that
would
you
say
play?
so.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah. And modern has changed enough over the years that even if you were a modern specialist 5, 10 years ago, there's no guarantee that
Oh
much of that
yeah.
knowledge, if any, carries through to the present day. But I mostly, I think, have stayed on top of those shifts in the format over time, and
Right.
it helps when you have this deck, which you can do that with over a prolonged period. But I have
Yeah.
branched out a bit, jumped around, and still been able to keep up and have success, I think. So
Well,
I did feel like on some level, if I was going to have some big PT finish, it was going to be at a modern Pro Tour.
yeah.
And it's been 4 years since the last one, so there was
Yeah.
a long wait there, but finally managed to make it happen.
Yeah, it's awesome. It's funny. I'm looking at the numbers and stuff from the tournament, and it's like, some of the stats coming out of it. Like Jake Beersley, the Rakdos deck that wins the whole tournament, 70% of his non-land cards were printed in the last 2 years. The most played cards in the entire tournament were the One Ring and Orcish Bowmasters. It seems like the entire format's being dominated by, of course, Modern Horizons 2 and now Lord of the Rings. What do you think about the format going forward? Like, a lot of people are starting to murmur about dark days ahead when you're talking about $1,500 or more decks. Like the winning list was, I think, clocking in at around 1,500 US. And now people are saying the ring might, maybe it gets banned. Like, it's not super oppressive, but at the same time, it's showing up in the kind of numbers that it just got printed 2 months ago, and it showed up as the #1 and Orcish Bowmaster's #2 card in the format. Like, what does this bode for Modern? Is this a good or bad thing? What do you think Modern's going to be like heading forward?
I don't put much stock in the price tag arguments generally, because usually those numbers come from, you go to one online store and you put the entire deck in a cart and you see on that store with whatever their markup is,
True.
what would you need to buy it with one click right now, which is, I think, realistically not how very many people at all actually engage with that side of Magic.
Right.
And looking at the specifics too, there was a time in Modern where the fetch lands were 50, 70,
100.
$100.
Yeah.
These kind of integral game pieces for the format were a lot more expensive. Whereas, yeah, if you look at the top line of this is what Scam costs, this is what Rhinos cost, then that might be discouraging. But there are also, it's easier to build a relatively cheap deck right now if you want to, compared to some of those points in the past. I do think that the rotation arguments, if you like, of, once the format is so defined by the Modern Horizons cards, and you can joke that Lord of the Rings is Modern Horizons 3 to some degree, then you lose some of that history and that continuity. And so, yeah, I mean, if Modern initially 12 years ago was meant to be this pipeline where cards would rotate out of Standard and then some of them would get this new lease on life later on in Modern, that I think that was always doomed to fail, especially as the card pool got larger and larger. And even the smaller formats like Pioneer, which have also tried to embody that mission statement, that hasn't been true there either.
No.
And when it has, it's been because the good cards are coming from Standard, and those are the good cards in every single format. So the days when Once Upon a Time and Oko, they were the best cards in Standard, Pioneer, Modern, Legacy, and Vintage even for a bit.
Right.
Like, you don't want to go towards that extreme either. So
Right.
I don't know. I think I get why people have those complaints, but I think that if you look at MH2 in particular, you go back to just before that set came out, Mod was not in a good place. And
No.
if you ask people, okay, what were the good decks at that time? Either they can't really tell you because no one was paying attention to Modern, because why would you? Or it's, it was deck X versus deck Y. We had that for months at that point. We needed a big hard reset. So
well,
I think, and so I think those arguments, I have some sympathy for them, but it's tough to argue like what the other world is meant to look like.
Right.
And I think there's a flip side to that nostalgia when it comes to Modern, where on the one hand you can play your deck for years on end and kind of lovingly craft it through all these turbulent waters. On the other hand, there are people who they just want Modern to be fixed in this point years ago when Humans was the best deck and they like playing Humans. Or how many people are there now who they still want Twin to be unbanned, and they actually what they really want is for Twin to be legal and be the best deck, and for them to feel smart because they get to play Twin, right? Like, it's, the format has to serve so many different interests, and it can't do all of that at the same time.
Right.
So as someone who like plays a lot of Magic, is a pretty enfranchised Magic player, I have mostly enjoyed keeping up with Modern as it's changed. If you're someone who engages with it once a week at a more casual level, then understandably, if it's not the format that you enjoy playing, maybe you're just not going to play it anymore.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think the games are much more interactive now. It's weird because of all the, free spells in Modern. It seems like with all the, the pitch elementals and everything else, but at least there's more interaction. I remember Modern being terrible when it was all just ships passing in the night. It was Infect and Storm and Affinity and all these decks that just really didn't care about what the opponent was doing at all, and Modern was miserable. I remember it being terrible back then. And then yeah, Modern Horizons 2 came out and whatnot, and then Ragavan, and everybody's complaining about the monkey and the Voke elementals and everything. But really, the monkey's a 2/1 that can die to fatal push it. Like, there's ways to interact with this stuff. I'd much rather have a format that's interactive like that than a bunch of ships passing the night. So yeah, I think Modern's in a good place, and that's, I think, what the gist of what you're saying here. You think actually Modern is in a good place right now, and going forward, of course there will be, it'll be no. Oh, okay. Maybe
Well,
I.
I wouldn't say that much necessarily, but it is what it is, right? And
Huh.
I think trying to harken back to the glory days that you remember, just think about the level of change that would be needed at this point to get it to that, even if that's
Yeah.
what you want, right? Like, we
Yeah.
could ban 20 cards and
Nah.
hope that that's going to return it to some level of
Magical.
balance, which maybe
Yeah.
never existed in the first place, right? And as you mentioned, there were times when, yeah, it was. I drew my Stony Silence after sideboard against Affinity, and the game ended on turn 2, pretty much, right? Or
Right.
I drew my Rest in Peace against Dredge, or like
Oh yeah.
you can identify frustrating aspects of Modern, which a lot of them don't actually exist in quite the same way anymore, across time. And I think just in general, right, both Magic
Right.
and in life, it's whenever you find yourself remembering this golden age, you should actually like take a step back and think just how golden was that in
Yeah.
reality.
Yeah, rose tinted glasses when you look back. Absolutely. Great. So before we close out on all this, what would you say going forward if let's say there was a huge tournament coming up next week in Modern, and a close friend or teammate was saying, Dom, what should I play? What do you think is good? Now we're post Barcelona here. Everybody's going to be rocking the team handshake Tron list, which was really interesting, and what they did was great and everything. Or the Kai Bude, their team, the Rhinos deck, or whatever it was. Now the aftermath, everybody's going to be playing these versions of the decks. Rakdos not playing Seasoned Pyromancer. They're all on Fable. That's obviously the correct choice now. I think we all know that. And, the sideboard, et cetera, et cetera. What do you think is positioned right now the best in Modern? Or what would be the 2 or 3 decks that you would recommend as the best going forward post Pro Tour?
The answer there might just be the top 3 decks from this Pro Tour, because
Yeah.
one way to look at the results is there was no new deck really that took the tournament by storm. It was mostly the decks that you knew existed, but some interesting tweaks and twists on those archetypes, right?
Right.
So I think that a lot of these decks, there's been some kind of inertia because there's just been no high stakes Modern tournament that the pros had to prepare for and take seriously since the
Right.
release of MH2. So now you're seeing, right, Rhinos, maybe this isn't its final form necessarily, but it looks better now, just a cleaner deck now
Oh,
than it
yeah.
did a few months ago, because there was actually an incentive to solve that problem.
Right.
And when you look at the win data, it's pretty rare for the decks at the top to also win at an impressive rate, just because mathematically that kind of converges towards this norm in the middle. And also, if these are the known targets, well, people are going to attack those targets as best they can. What you
Right.
saw though was Scam, Rhinos, and Tron all put up pretty impressive numbers, despite being the 3 most popular decks. So
Targeted.
that suggests a level of resiliency there that is going to persist over the next few months. Maybe Tron less so, because the non-handshake Tron players didn't have a great time for the most part, and people will be packing the hate now. But it's a little tough to know actually how you're meant to target the Scam deck, for example, or
Right.
even Rhinos these days, where they have these more flexible answers and so on. They're less of a one-trick Cascade deck. They're just pretty fundamentally solid decks. So hard to go wrong with those. But then even online already, you're seeing a kind of pushback against that. So Hammer is kind of having this comeback, even though it was nowhere at the PC, because you look at those top 3 decks, Hammer lines up pretty well against them. So I think if you don't want to just join one of those top 3, there is hope for you yet.
Merfolk. There's always Merfolk.
Sure.
I mean,
there sure is. Yeah.
people were telling me about, did you hear about the Merfolk player who went 8-2? And I'm like, yeah, but the sample, like, Scam had what, 442 matches played with a 55% win rate overall. That's 400 matches versus the 10 matches of Merfolk. Like, did this player just run really hot? Or what do you think of these weird outliers that sometimes come out of the Pro Tour data? Like, had this person done better in the draft, we might have seen a Merfolk deck in the top 8. What would people have been saying about that? But
Yeah, and you need some amount of that, I think, because in a format where part of the appeal, once again, is just getting to master a deck over time and really develop this love for a deck. To see someone who has done that crack through, and I guess I filled that role in the top 8 here. But you need people like that, right?
right.
And Merfolk in particular has a very dedicated, very vocal fan base out there
Oh
who,
yeah.
this guy is their champion now. He's their god. And so you want some of that among the, oh yeah, Tron did well again, or we knew Scam was going to be the best deck. Or like you need to liven
Right.
that up a bit with, this is the underdog story of, there's one Merfolk player in the tournament, but like they technically have the best win rate because there's one of them and he went 8-2 or something. So
Right. And that's the problem I think a lot of people miss there is, yes, he had a great record in the constructed portion, but that doesn't mean take Merfolk to your next big tournament in Modern, your RCQs that are coming up in the next, regional championship qualifier season and stuff like that. So it's interesting, but
well,
yeah, oh yeah.
no, the people who play Merfolk, none of them get there because they're sitting down and thinking, all right, I've run the numbers and I've decided the deck that gives me the best chance of doing well at this tournament is Merfolk. They're playing Merfolk because they really love Merfolk. And that's fine. That's good. That is what Modern needs to be a popular format at the LGS, like semi-competitive level, and not
Right.
just at the elite cutthroat PT level.
Right. Right.
And those two versions of Modern are very different a lot of the time, and the format gets in trouble when those diverge too much. When
Right.
a deck is so obviously broken that you can't just flip a few cards around in your Merfolk sideboard and actually have a decent shot still.
Right, right. Yeah, and that's interesting, and it's almost a parallel to your deck choice and why I was asking about that earlier. Choosing Amulet, was it just because again, familiarity with the deck, or was it objectively speaking well positioned for the tournament? I mean, maybe I don't know if the Merfolk player thought Merfolk was, they must have tested it against a lot of these other top decks. They must have come to some conclusions about these matchups and stuff, and said, yeah, I feel like this is a good choice. I mean, it's similar to you with Amulet Titan in a way, right? Not quite as extreme, I would say. Amulet, I think, is more of an established, choice and not that far from actual tier one, the top of tier one. But yeah,
Yeah, I think that Merfolk player posted a Twitter thread where they acknowledged, yeah, I was always going to play Merfolk, and they were
no matter
self-aware
what.
enough about that to just admit that up front.
Oh, okay,
And
never mind.
scoreboard, I suppose.
Yeah, bonus. Interesting. Okay, well, that's the tournament. The picture of the modern metagame. Man, it's great to hear all these insights and stuff. It's fascinating for me. But moving forward, what does the future hold for Dominic Harvey? What are you going to be doing? You were talking about maybe doing some streaming at some point. Are you going to take it easy? You're going to be at Worlds. You're now qualified for what? Worlds and the next 2 PTs, I think, something like that, right?
Yeah, Worlds and the next 3 PTs, I think it
Three.
is. But Worlds is in 6, 7 weeks. So right now, that's the
Right.
focus, and there's no time to really take a breather and step back. But after that, there's a bit of an off season, and gonna make the most of that. Just
Yeah.
try and focus on other things a bit and decompress from this whole experience. But yeah, next year there's
Right.
a lot of high level Magic to look forward to, and hopefully more finishes like this one.
Great. And yeah, I'll be there in September as well in Vegas. So hopefully I bump into you
Nice,
there.
nice.
But is there anything else you want to shout out? Where can people find you on Twitter or elsewhere?
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter at Dominic Harvey. You can find me on Twitch eventually, or currently just logging in Twitch chats. Just Dom HRV over there. As you said, find Dominarius Judgment
Yeah.
on how do they say, Stitcher, SoundCloud, wherever you
Podcatchers.
get your
Yeah.
podcasts. Yeah, and then
Yeah.
hit me up on either on Twitter or any other platform if you're interested in coaching or just have
Hmm.
generic questions. Happy to just chat over stuff. Usually can get back to people pretty quick. So always the door is always open over there.
Awesome. And yeah, do not ever underestimate the impact of getting an excellent coaching session. I know a lot of pro players who are not familiar with the limited format will get coaching sessions from other limited specialists. And if you're interested in constructed, yeah, talking to somebody like yourself, Tom, is invaluable.
I
Yeah.
mean, I got limited coaching from Sam Black before the last PT, and money well spent, I think.
Yeah. Oh yeah. It's awesome. And Yeah, I think a lot of people aren't sure about the value there, but getting a specialist, somebody like you talking about a deck like that, like, Amulet Titan, I mean, God, you can't get that kind of insight and coaching experience anywhere else. Definitely give them a look. Modern RCQ season is coming, so there's going to be a lot of attention on the format. We'll see how the decks, and the format develops, but thank you so much for joining us, Dom. I really appreciate it. Congratulations again on your finish. It's an incredible accomplishment, especially considering, it was a deck that you brought in. Yeah, not a lot of other people did. So really just an awesome story and the ups and downs of the tournament. And it was a pleasure to talk to you. So hopefully we get to do it again soon.
Yeah, well, thanks for the kind words, and thanks for having me on.
All right. Take care.
Yeah.
All right, so I was watching the Pro Tour, and every time you came on screen, I lived in Asia for many years before I moved back to Canada, and I speak and read and write Korean, and I saw your
Okay.
sleeves. The genius. What? The genius sleeves that you were using? The Korean writing on your sleeves? I recognized it. It was like it's a show that I love. With this, they play all these crazy games and they have all these celebrities and different people that come on there. When I saw your sleeves, I'm like, what? I'm like, does he know about this show? Where did he just buy them at the venue? Tell us how you ended up with these sleeves and what they are and maybe what they mean to you, or
No, so those are custom Dragon Shields. I had to order those, and no accident there. I would say the Genius, if not my favorite TV show, at least one of them. Certainly up there on the podium. And it's obviously for an English-speaking audience, it's pretty obscure. But for the people who know about it, I've never heard a mixed or bad review. It's almost always, wow, I felt this, and I found this, and oh my god, I fell in love.
Yeah.
And so wanted to shout out to the other genius heads out there, and hopefully people will have kind of investigated that for themselves, and they'll check out an episode, and then they're going to check out every single other episode and get swept up in that as well.
I love it. Oh, so I got it immediately. I was like, what? And then I even looked online. I'm like, they sell Genius sleeves? And I couldn't find them anywhere. So you actually had them custom made? That's brilliant. Oh, that's awesome.
Well, the custom Dragon Shields are actually pretty good. That's a whole arm of their operation at this point. And so after this now, I might get custom sleeves with my dog on them and her incredibly goofy expressions, or the water's your oyster, really. Within reason, you can get whatever you want printed on those.
All right, Dom, big fan of the Genius. Go check it out. All right, thanks, buddy. See ya.